I never thought I would end up in hell, but it happened, and I was only 16. Back then, I was nothing but anger and bitterness. It felt like my whole world was a storm, and I had no one to take it out on but my little sister, who was just 14 at the time. I made her life miserable every chance I got. I would mock her, break her things, call her names that cut deeper than I realized. She was always the target, bearing the weight of my rage without even knowing why. My parents were, of course, furious. They tried everything to keep the peace, but each fight we had only deepened my anger. I would call my sister a tattletale, even say things as terrible as wishing she had never been born. I told her I hated her more times than I could count. The words cut like blades, and I could see it in her face every time. But I was too wrapped up in my own darkness to care. One evening, my parents were both stuck at work, leaving just me and my sister at home. My mother had called me just before she left, her voice stern, telling me there would be serious consequences if she found out I had been anything less than kind to my sister. I hung up, dismissing her warning like it was nothing. Not long after, though, the tension between us reached a boiling point. I cannot even remember what triggered it, but I felt a violent fury rising inside me. Next thing I knew, my sister was lying on the kitchen floor, her face twisted in pain, blood slipping through her fingers as she clutched her nose. I had broken it. Without a second thought, I tossed a roll of paper towels at her, muttering something about getting over it, and stormed off to my room. I remember lying down, feeling a strange emptiness. But it was late, and I figured I would just sleep it off. But then, things changed. What felt like a few minutes later, I opened my eyes and something was terribly wrong. My bed was gone. The familiar surroundings of my room had vanished, replaced by an endless stretch of brick floor and pitch-black darkness all around me. I stood up slowly, trying to make sense of it, but all I found was a long, dark tunnel stretching out into the unknown. I had no choice but to move forward. With every step, my footsteps echoed through the tunnel, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. Panic started to rise as I tried every way I could think of to wake up, convinced this had to be some twisted nightmare. I slapped myself, screamed, pinched my arm. Nothing worked. I was trapped, and I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. Finally, when I was on the verge of collapsing, I heard footsteps behind me. It was a faint sound at first, barely louder than a whisper. My heart started pounding, and I forced myself to turn around. In the distance, I could make out the silhouette of someone, or something, slowly coming toward me. As it got closer, details emerged, and my heart skipped a beat. The figure looked human, but everything about it was wrong. It was pitch black, like a shadow had taken physical form, and its eyes, two glowing yellow orbs, cut through the darkness. There were no other features, no mouth, no nose, just those eyes locked onto me. I wanted to run, but my feet were frozen to the floor. It stopped just a few feet away and stared at me for a moment that felt like forever. Then, in a voice like gravel scraping against metal, it spoke. "Follow me." I shook my head, instinct taking over, but it stepped closer, its eyes narrowing. "Follow me," it growled again, its voice colder and more menacing than before. The air around us seemed to thicken, pressing against me until I felt like I was suffocating. Terrified, I obeyed. I followed the figure down the winding, endless tunnel. It moved silently, while every one of my footsteps echoed as if mocking me. After what felt like an eternity, it turned a corner and disappeared. I rushed after it, desperate for something, anything that made sense. When I turned the corner, I found myself standing in my sister's bedroom. It was exactly as I remembered it. The soft glow of her nightlight, her posters on the walls, the stuffed animals piled on her bed. I could still smell her floral perfume lingering in the air. But something was wrong. The room felt colder, darker, like a shadow hung over everything. The figure was still there, standing near her bed. It raised one arm and pointed toward the door. Just as it did, the door burst open, flying off its hinges as if someone had thrown it with supernatural force. My sister stepped through, her face twisted into an expression I had never seen before. Her eyes locked onto mine, and her lips curled into a smile that sent a chill down my spine. I barely had time to react before my sister lunged at me, a wild, feral look in her eyes. She was on me in seconds, moving with a strength and fury that seemed impossible. Her fists rained down on me, her nails clawed at my skin, and her teeth, she was biting me like an animal. I stumbled back, trying to get her off me, but there was no escaping her grip. It was like she was possessed, and I was her prey. "Stop! What are you doing?" I shouted, desperate and panicked. But she did not respond. Her nails tore through my skin, her fists striking with bone-breaking force. I could feel my body giving in, bruises blooming under each hit, my skin raw from the scratches. My screams echoed, but they sounded small, lost in the crushing silence around us. Just when I thought I could not take any more, she stopped, breathing heavily as she stood over me. Through the haze of pain, I looked up and saw her reach for something on her shelf, a cheerleading trophy, heavy and made of solid metal. My heart sank as she lifted it high above her head, her eyes still locked on mine with that twisted expression. The first blow landed on my head with a sickening crack. Pain exploded, and I felt something in my skull give way. She lifted the trophy again, and for a split second, I saw tears streaming down her face. She was crying, blood from her crooked nose mingling with her tears. But that did not stop her. She brought the trophy down again, harder, with a force that sent a fresh wave of agony through me. The pain was unbearable. I knew I would not survive another hit. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the final blow, my mind numb with terror. But it never came. When I opened my eyes, I saw the shadowy figure standing over me. It gripped my hair and yanked me up with such force that I swore I felt my neck crack. The figure's face was close to mine, those piercing yellow eyes filling my vision, trapping me. And then in a voice that sounded disturbingly familiar, it spoke. "This is your hell. When you die, this is where you will come. You will suffer every pain, every moment, again and again, for all eternity. You will never escape." The voice was my sister's, twisted and hollow, carrying a deep, seething hatred that made my blood run cold. With a rough shove, it threw me to the ground and I landed hard on the brick floor. I felt a jolt of pain radiate up my spine, and a scream tore from my throat as my body contorted in agony. My vision blurred, and everything started to go dark. When I finally came to, I was lying in my bed, drenched in sweat. But the pain had not faded. It felt as though my body had been through a brutal beating. Every bone, every muscle throbbed. I struggled to sit up, my head pounding with a splitting ache. I staggered to my bathroom, leaning over the sink, and forced myself to look in the mirror. My face was bruised, my eyes swollen and ringed with black, as though I had been in a vicious fight. My clothes were torn, and beneath the fabric, my skin was a patchwork of cuts and bruises, matching exactly where my sister had attacked me. As I stared, I felt a dull pain in my chest, and when I opened my mouth, blood dripped from my lips. I reached for a towel, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. There was no denying it. What I had experienced was real. Somehow I had been dragged into a living nightmare, a vision of hell that had left its mark on me, inside and out. The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion. I tried to convince myself it had been a twisted dream, but the bruises, the cuts, the aching bones, all of it was too real. My parents asked what had happened, but I had no answer for them. How could I explain that I had been to hell and back without sounding insane? I mumbled something about getting into a fight at school, and though they were suspicious, they eventually let it go. I could not escape the memory of that dark figure, its haunting yellow eyes and my sister's voice dripping with malice. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of that awful place, the endless tunnel, the brick floor, my sister's twisted smile as she raised the trophy. It all haunted me day and night. I could still feel the phantom pain of her blows, the deep bruises on my skin, a constant reminder of the horror I had endured. Days turned into weeks, and the bruises finally faded, but the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I kept my distance from my sister, too scared to even be in the same room as her. I apologized, mumbling something about being a terrible brother, but she just looked at me with confusion, clearly unsure what had caused this sudden change. Over time, our relationship softened. I went out of my way to be kind to her, doing things I had never done before, helping her with homework, asking about her day, even letting her pick the TV shows we watched. Slowly, she began to forgive me, and the hostility that had been between us seemed to disappear. It was as if we were finally becoming the siblings we should have been all along. But at night, the fear returned. I would lie awake, staring into the darkness, expecting those glowing yellow eyes to appear in the shadows of my room. I could still hear the echo of that voice, reminding me that hell was waiting for me. I became afraid to fall asleep, terrified that I would open my eyes and find myself back in that awful place. 4 years have passed since that night, but the memory of what I went through has never faded. In some ways, it feels more real now than it did back then, like it was burned into my mind, impossible to forget. I still see the bruises and cuts in my dreams, feel the pain of each blow, and hear that voice in my sister's twisted tone. And every time the message is the same. That place, hell, was waiting for me. I tried to bury it, tried to convince myself that whatever happened that night was nothing more than a waking nightmare. But there are moments, quiet moments when I am alone, that I know it was real. Sometimes I catch something in the corner of my eye, a shadow lingering just a little too long, a figure watching from the darkness. And each time those piercing yellow eyes flash in my mind as if they are still following me, waiting for me to slip up. Even though my sister and I are closer now, I have never told her about what happened that night. How could I? She is happier these days, and I do not want to dredge up old pain, make her think that any of it was her fault. I know it was me who brought this curse upon myself. I made her life a living hell for so long, and that place, that terrifying, torturous place, had shown me exactly what I deserved. The fear of dying never leaves me. The thought of closing my eyes and not knowing if I will wake up here or in that place sends a chill through me every single night. Sometimes when I am half asleep, I swear I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom, slow and heavy like someone dragging their feet. I keep telling myself it is just the house settling, but deep down, I know that something is waiting for me, just out of sight. On nights like these, when the fear claws its way up my spine, I stay awake until the first light of dawn. Only then do I allow myself to rest, feeling safer somehow in the daylight, where shadows cannot hide as easily. But every night, when darkness falls again, I can feel it creeping closer. The next few months were a haze of dread and insomnia. My days were spent trying to act normal, putting on a mask for my friends and family, pretending that everything was fine. But every night, as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, that familiar fear would settle in, and I would be wide awake, staring into the darkness, waiting. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I heard the sound again. Soft footsteps, barely a whisper, creaking slowly down the hallway outside my room. My heart hammered in my chest and I strained to listen, telling myself it was just my imagination, or maybe my parents moving around. But then I heard it again, closer this time, almost right outside my door. It was the unmistakable sound of bare feet, slow and deliberate, dragging across the wooden floor. I held my breath, frozen, my mind racing with terror. It was the same sound I had heard in that endless tunnel, the same creeping, heavy footsteps that haunted me in my nightmares. Unable to bear it any longer, I reached over and flicked on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. I half expected to see those yellow eyes staring at me from the doorway, but when I looked, there was nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching into darkness. The footsteps had stopped. I lay back in bed, my pulse pounding in my ears, and tried to convince myself it had been nothing more than a trick of my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it, a presence, lurking just beyond the light, watching and waiting. Over time, my paranoia grew. I began to see shadows moving in the corners of my vision, flickers of darkness that vanished the moment I turned to look. At first, I tried to ignore it, but it became impossible. It was everywhere, at home, at school, even when I was out with friends. No matter where I was, I could feel something following me, like an invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders. One evening, I was alone in my room, trying to distract myself with a book, when I felt it again. That suffocating presence, closer than ever. The air seemed to thicken, and a chill ran down my spine. I looked up, and there it was, a shadow standing in the corner of my room, watching me. Its form was indistinct, blending into the darkness, but I could see those yellow eyes glowing faintly, burning into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to run, but I could not move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The figure took a slow step forward, its eyes never leaving mine. The room seemed to grow colder with each step, the air heavy with a feeling of malice that made my stomach twist. Finally it stopped, just a few feet away, and I could feel its gaze piercing into me, a silent judgment that made my whole body tremble. It leaned in, and in a voice that sounded like the crackling of distant fire, it whispered, "Soon." And then, just like that, it was gone. The room was empty again, but the cold lingered, and the feeling of dread clawed at my chest. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next as I struggled to keep my grip on reality. I became withdrawn, isolating myself from everyone around me. My friends tried to reach out, but I pushed them away, too afraid of what might happen if they got too close. I could not risk bringing them into this nightmare. My parents grew worried, but every time they asked what was wrong, I shrugged it off, pretending that everything was fine. But it was not fine. The visions became more frequent, more vivid. Every night I saw those yellow eyes in my dreams, felt the icy grip of the shadow pressing down on me. I began to hear voices, whispers in the darkness, calling my name, mocking me. Sometimes they sounded like my sister, but other times they were deeper, harsher, filled with a hatred that made my skin crawl. One night I woke to the sound of laughter, a low, menacing chuckle that filled the room, echoing off the walls. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around, but there was no one there. The laughter faded, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against the wall. It was coming from the corner of my room, the same spot where I had seen the shadow before. Slowly the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was inside my head, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I clutched my ears, desperate to block out the sound, but it only grew louder, filling my mind with a cacophony of noise and dread. I felt like I was losing my mind, spiraling into a darkness that I could not escape. In a moment of desperation, I decided to confide in my sister. She was the only person who might understand, who had been part of that awful night, even if she did not remember it. I waited until our parents were out of the house, then sat her down and told her everything. The tunnel, the shadow, the yellow eyes, the voice that had whispered of hell and suffering. At first she looked at me like I was crazy, her face pale and drawn. But as I continued, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a glimmer of understanding, or maybe fear. She did not say anything for a long time, just stared at me, her expression unreadable. Finally she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I have nightmares too," she said, her voice trembling. "Sometimes I dream about that night. I see you lying on the ground, covered in blood, and I'm standing over you, holding something heavy." She swallowed hard, her eyes wide with fear. "And I hear a voice, telling me to hurt you, telling me that it's what you deserve." A shiver ran down my spine as she spoke, and I realized, with a sickening sense of dread, that we were both haunted by the same darkness, the same twisted force that had bound us to that night. The revelation only deepened my fear. If this was real, if we were both trapped in this nightmare, then there was no escaping it. Every day the shadow seemed to grow closer, its presence pressing down on me like a weight I could not shake. I felt it in every dark corner, in every whisper of the wind, in every flicker of movement just out of sight. One night as I lay in bed, I felt the cold settle over me again, deeper and more intense than ever before. I closed my eyes, praying for sleep, but the darkness seemed to pull me under, dragging me into a familiar, suffocating blackness. I was back in the tunnel. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the brick floor stretched endlessly before me, illuminated only by the faint, sickly glow of those yellow eyes in the distance. They were waiting for me, calling to me, drawing me forward like a moth to a flame. I tried to resist, to turn back, but my feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the eyes, deeper into the darkness. As I drew closer, I saw shapes emerging from the shadows, figures twisted and grotesque, their faces contorted in pain, their eyes empty and hollow. They reached out to me, their fingers scraping against my skin, leaving trails of icy fire in their wake. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was powerless, trapped in their grasp as they pulled me closer to the figure at the end of the tunnel. The shadow stood there waiting, its yellow eyes burning with a hatred that seemed to consume everything around it. It raised a hand, pointing at me, and in a voice that echoed with the screams of countless souls it spoke, "Welcome back." In that moment, I knew that I would never escape this nightmare, that this darkness would follow me for the rest of my life. I was bound to it, cursed to carry it with me, a constant reminder of the hell that awaited me. And as the darkness closed in around me, I felt a cold, unyielding certainty settle in my heart. This was my fate, and there was no escape.